Well, it has become customary and also a tradition that the moderator makes a presentation sometime at the beginning part of the commission meeting. And also that has been the tradition that some of the global trends or geopolitical trends also are described or presented as part of the presentation, mainly on the fact that this will helpful for us for our discussions and deliberations, especially when we are going to focus on some of our programs and activities and also identifying the priorities for future engagements. Well, we have started with the opening of this 60th anniversary and also the simple way of the commemoration of the centenary of the 1925 Life and Work Conference. It has been one of our earlier discussions and especially at the officers meeting that we should take an opportunity to reflect on the 1925 Life and Work Conference, because when we trace the evolution or the genesis or even the metamorphosis of the formation of the CCIA Commission and the CCIA as such, of course it goes back to the 1925 Stockholm Conference, which we will be discussing from tomorrow onwards in different presentations. Especially Bishop Jonas will make the historical presentation and the perspectives which will be shared tomorrow in the first session. The commemoration of the Stockholm Conference once again provides us an opportunity to remind churches across the world to take the initiative as peacemakers. Peacemaking is a priority for churches in its ministry. Every time, especially a time whenever we discuss about the needs and priorities, especially in the context of conflicts, war and peace, of course the ecumenical movement has been focusing on some of these urgent priorities and the concerns. Here we are gathering for our 60th meeting of the CCIA. That also a very unique opportunity for us. I don't think that any other commission has this kind of a privilege for meeting continuously for 60 meetings in its past. It is also as an opportunity for the CCIA to review and set its strategies and priorities to address some of the crucial issues the world is facing today in several regions, including the ongoing threats to peace and security in different parts of the world. It is in this context that we need to spend a little bit time to reflect about the ongoing situation, the global trends and also the ecumenical responses in order to set CCIA's priorities. It is generally assumed that the world is passing through one of the most divided times since the Cold War. Within such a short span of time since the beginning of 2025, the world has witnessed stunning changes and challenges. Deepening divisions, mistrust and fragmentation are reshaping international relations. Emerging trends have led to a dearth of global cooperation in addressing geopolitical, geoeconomic, geostrategic and humanitarian concerns. What we are witnessing today is fragmentation within a multipolar global order. Such a trend often enforces rules and norms created by middle and great powers for selfish goals. However, the Western-led global order is not expected to decline so soon and will likely continue to hold prominent influence for some more time. Meanwhile, alternative power centers are likely to strengthen, led not only by China but also by key emerging powers, including India and the Arabian Gulf states. The intervention of some oil-rich Gulf countries such as Saudi Arabia and Qatar during President Trump's recent visit to the Middle East, resolving certain West Asian crises such as in Syria and Iran. This is a clear example of the growing influence and strength of non-Western powers in international politics. It has been predicted that these global trends will continue to be fractured across geopolitical, environmental, societal, economic, and technological domains. The world is experiencing a surge in conflicts accompanied by weakening or diminishing of security, mutual trust, and a collective sense of shared values. Involuntary migration, internal displacement, and denial of human rights and civic freedoms are further eroding social stability. Environmental threats have aggravated in most parts of the world, and extreme weather conditions are foreseen to become an even more serious concern. While technological advancements have greatly benefited companies and also individuals through modern tools and platforms such as artificial intelligence, concerns also have been expressed about the adverse impacts and outcomes of artificial intelligence technologies. The changes introduced by President Trump within the first 3 or 4 months of his presidency have been quite astonishing. Several European leaders have commented on this. Why Europe must urgently redefine its global role and leadership in the context of recession, risk, climate retreat, and collapsing alliances. They observed recent trends such as the United States voting alongside Russia, Belarus, and North Korea against its traditional allies, threat of annexing other territories and countries, escalating trade wars, proposed mass deportations, a near total cut in US foreign aid, including to various multilateral organizations, thousands of federal workers being laid off, and a marked shift in climate change priorities. These are just a few of the dramatic changes seen in US politics and its foreign policy shifts in less than 3 months. Economically, the situation has deteriorated significantly. The US economy is emerging a risky situation of recession, which is certain to disturb the global economy. US foreign policy under President Trump's second term does not give hope in terms of support for European security, and his policies toward Ukraine has shown how much European security still depends on American hard power 35 years after the Cold War ended. However, the US now feels globally overextended and needs Europe to take more responsibility for its own defense. As economic and political instability persists and a trade war is emerging, Europe and the UK have taken radical fiscal steps. For example, the European Commission's proposed Rearm Europe Plan Readiness 2030 outlines concrete legal and financial means to support the defense investments of member states. It is an ambitious defense package envisaged by the European Union, providing financial levers at the immediate disposal of EU member states to quickly and significantly increase defense investments and defense capabilities. In Germany, a historic political deal on defense investment was made recently when a 2/3 majority of the German parliament voted to allow a huge increase in defense and infrastructure spending, a seismic shift for the country that could reshape European defense. The UK also has decided to deepen its defense and security cooperation within EU. While President Trump makes eloquent promises regarding his plans to resolve Ukraine crisis, his rhetoric gives the impression that he may seek to extract diplomatic and military advantages from alliances. This is what a London-based journalist Edward Carr stated. If America is to continue to back Europe, Mr. Trump will want something tangible in return, whether on trade, military contracts, or direct payments. He could even do a deal with Mr. Putin over the heads of European leaders to carve up Ukraine. Carr further comments that either way, as members of an explicitly transactional NATO, European countries will no longer feel they can depend on America's cast iron promise to fight alongside them if they are attacked. Another important geopolitical choice for Trump will be how to deal with China. Though its economy is currently weak, China is now a more aggressive and formidable adversary than when Trump first assumed the presidency in 2017. During his trip to Middle East, President Trump announced the lifting of sanctions on Syria, along with hundreds of billions of dollars in new arms sales and US-Saudi business agreements. What would be the implications for forging strategic relationship between the US and Saudi Arabia? It is actually, as Brian Kautilus, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, commented recently, it is a strategic linchpin which is a different and new way to think about it than Americans have thought about the Middle East, which is typically associated with endless war and terrorism at one time. Trump is hoping that Saudi Arabia will join the Abraham Accords and contribute to stability in Middle East region. Additionally, he hopes for a better deal with Iran and stability for the new Syrian government with all sanctions removed. Is it really going to happen? Search in global context and the alarming trends that is actually worrisome. The world is currently occupied with a major crisis in Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. The changing nature of war and conflicts in some of the notable conflict areas is alarming. The conflicts we witness today differ differently or significantly from those discussed by church leaders at the Stockholm Conference in 1925 that was held in the aftermath of the First World War situation, or at subsequent world ecumenical conferences such as the 1937 Oxford Conference or the post-Second World War Cambridge Conference in 1946, where the CCIA was formed. The increasing conflicts and war situation, the arms race and procurement of weapons, increased defense spending, internal displacement, growing numbers of refugees and migrants fleeing their ancestral lands for safety and economic security, and increased level of poverty, hunger, economic deprivation, and denial of basic human rights. These are all visible and evident in Asia, Africa, and Europe, several parts of Europe, and also in the Latin American continent. The Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, through its project on the rule of law armed conflicts, has identified more than 110 armed conflict situations in different regions in the world. Some of these conflicts make headlines daily, others do not. Some of them have been lasting for more than 50 years. Among these, more than 45 armed conflicts are taking place in the Middle East and the North Africa region. And Israel's ruthless bombing of Gaza since the breakdown of the ceasefire in March has killed over 2,300 Palestinians. Syria, fractured and divided after 13 years of devastating civil war and decades of authoritarian dynasty rule, continues to suffer. Deadly clashes involving Islamist armed forces, security forces, and fighters from the Druze religious minority near Damascus are yet another sign of the continuing fragility of Syria's security situation. In Europe, 4 of 7 armed conflicts are taking place, include those of Russia, Ukraine, and then in Moldova, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Georgia, and between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Africa has entered a new era of war, now ranked second in the number of armed conflicts per region, with more than 35 international armed conflicts. A surge in Africa's conflicts has gone largely unnoticed amid higher profile wars in Ukraine and Middle East. Asia is the theater of 19 international armed conflicts involving more than 20 armed groups, which are happening mainly in Afghanistan, India, Myanmar, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, China, and the Philippines. Several Latin American countries are grappling with ongoing conflicts and tensions, many of which are fueled by organized crime. The shadow of geopolitics looms large over the Pacific Islands region, bringing with another level of uncertainty, particularly due to the geostrategic competition between the United States and China in the Pacific. A significant factor shaping the region's future is how a new Trump administration might alter policy of funding commitments. What should be the role of CCIA and more specifically the commissioners of CCIA? As we are experiencing numerous conflict situations and humanitarian crises in our surroundings, should we not answerable to the question what is the role of the global ecumenical community and what would be the role of the CCIA in terms of engaging at least the WCC member churches' involvement and direct actions in advocacy? Should we limit our advocacy through issuing statements whenever there is an executive or central committee meeting? A credible and just peace has many dimensions. Peace between people, peace between nations, peace within the community, peace between beliefs and religions, peace with creation, and peace with God. It contains all aspects of peace that the Bible calls shalom and is personified in the person of Jesus Christ. The World Council of Churches has consistently prioritized peace building and peace initiatives and peace advocacy. The CCIA has been specially mandated to work in this particular area, and over the years, CCIA has focused its effort through manifold activities. The Peace to the Cities program, which lasted for several years, and the Decade to Overcome Violence started in 2001. Those were significant programmatic initiatives by the WCC in peace-building initiative. Those efforts culminated in major global events, the International Ecumenical Peace Convocation, which brought together diverse voices for peace. All of these were initiated and implemented by the WCC and coordinated and facilitated by the CCIA. It is true that we are engaged in certain online discussions every now and then. But what are the concrete steps we can take collectively to ensure more active ecumenical engagement in global advocacy together with the WCC member churches and partners? The trend is that WCC has been succumbing to certain external pressures to form separate ecumenical platforms since the early 2000s, and this trend was further cemented by 2020, which had already weakened CCIA and its functions. When we meet here for the 60th meeting of the CCIA, we are reminded of the long journey of the Commission and all those who have been part of this Commission and its witness in manifold ways over nearly 8 decades. The CCIA was born in 1946, even before WCC was officially founded in 1948. Over the past 79 years, the CCIA has met at least 60 times, including this meeting. No other commission in the history of WCC or its various commissions has had such a unique and splendid opportunity to meet consistently. At one point, there were certain attempts within the Council to abandon the CCIA, to change the name of the CCIA, even attempts to re-register the CCIA in UN ECOSOC solely under the name World Council of Churches, thus eliminating the CCIA part. Fortunately, those efforts were never realized, whether they stemmed from the deliberate intention or a lack of understanding of the Commission's history and tradition. The unique character and distinct mandate of the CCIA were ultimately recognized and upheld. This is the reason why we are still meeting here under the label of CCIA. In 2026, the CCIA will complete 80 years of its ecumenical journey or prophetic witness. I mentioned about this in our meeting last year. We should now consider the options and possibilities for commemorating the 80th anniversary of the CCIA in an appropriate way. And I request the members of the CCIA to come up with ideas and suggestions for the staff to move forward. In the coming years, we will have several opportunities to discuss emerging global trends. In the coming days, we will have several opportunities to discuss emerging global trends in international relations and geopolitical developments, as well as our ecumenical responses to these situations. We currently have 5 working groups as part of the CCIA, focusing on peace and security, human rights, global governance, Middle East, and refugees, migration, and statelessness. We shall be receiving reports from these working groups along with their proposals for follow-up actions in the coming years. This will be an opportunity for us to reflect on what we have achieved since our last meeting. We are now analyzing, to a certain extent, some of the global and regional issues that warrant our attention, ongoing monitoring, and ecumenical accompaniment. As part of our efforts, we need to undertake follow-up initiatives to respond to emerging situations and different areas of concern. Let us move forward. Thank you. Well, now the time for Director's reports. May I request the Director to present his reports, because please listen this carefully, because number of activities that is those have been carried out during the past year, especially since our last meeting. This will be summarized and presented. Of course, some of these follow-up actions, of course, we will be discussing later in coming days. So in that way, that we need to bring some kind of a connections between what has been happening in the past and what is going to be proposed for future.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I should start by telling you that after my first report delivered to this generation of CCIA in our joint meeting in Geneva in March last year, I had a couple of significant points of feedback. One was that I should bring more content and detail about the programmatic activities that are undertaken in CCIA's name. So I've tried to do that. You'll see that there's a lot more content of that kind, but it leads to a very long text. So I'm going to do my best to present that, or at least to table it, for your reading and reference. And there will be further, I will skip some items because we have colleagues here who will later on elaborate on those issues and the programmatic activities. I will just mention them, but skip some of those items. But I would encourage you to read the content in full in this report as a basis for your reflections, and in particular for what we build up by way of a consolidated work plan later on. The other key item of feedback I received was please don't be so depressing, because I presented a very bleak picture, evidently, in my first report. And that feedback came from none other than His Eminence Metropolitan Gabriel, so I have to take it very seriously. I'm not sure whether I will achieve the purpose, however, because unfortunately it's clear to all of us that circumstances haven't improved in our wider world since I presented a report to you last time. But I hope that we can recognize the challenge and rise to it with goodwill and faith and energy. And so I hope that in the end, while recognizing the gravity of the challenge, we find energy and commitment and inspiration for an appropriate response to it. So, this year has been called a special ecumenical year because of the coincidence of anniversaries it marks. We've mentioned it already. The 1700th anniversary of the First Ecumenical Council at Nicaea in 325, a pivotal moment in the history of Christian faith and for the ecumenical journey today. Let me just open a parenthesis. One of the colleagues, I think it was Father Alexios, pointed out to me that on the very day when we have the presentation by Dimitra Kukura on theological bridges between Nicaea and Stockholm, is also the day historically that the Council of Nicaea started, 1700 years ago. Can you believe? Providential. Yeah. But of course, it's also the centenary of the Universal Christian Conference on Life and Work, convened by Archbishop Nathan Söderblom in Stockholm in 1925. And indeed, the Stockholm Conference established the foundations of the life and work pillar of ecumenical thought. Life and work and faith and order combine in undergirding the ecumenical movement and the World Council of Churches as its leading global expression. But for CCIA, another cluster of anniversaries carry special weight. For this year also marks the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, and with it, the anniversaries of the liberation of the concentration and death camps, and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the same historical context, it is 80 years since the San Francisco Conference and the establishment of the United Nations, a transformative moment of fundamental significance for CCIA's own history and work. And it is also 75 years since the start of the Korean War, an event with which CCIA and WCC have deep and complicated associations. And next year, as the moderator has observed, 2026 will be the 80th anniversary of CCIA itself and of the official beginning of its work for human rights, peace, justice, and the rule of international law. Our meeting in Athens during these days, generously, very generously, hosted by the Church of Greece, thank you Metropolitan Gabriel, has a dual purpose. Firstly, we gather to reflect on the heritage of the life and work movement launched in Stockholm 100 years ago. This is not just an exercise in academic historical inquiry. As we are beginning to appreciate more and more acutely, our current global context is looking increasingly like the historical circumstances that led to the catastrophic conflicts of the first half of the 20th century. And there is much wisdom to be gleaned from the inter-church discussions in Stockholm in 1925 and in subsequent iterations of the life and work movement that may help guide our responses and actions today. Secondly, and connected directly to this first purpose, we are here to plan the work of this Commission in the years ahead of us, in a context of unprecedented challenges to the most fundamental principles and purposes that our forebears in the ecumenical movement had sought to advance through this Commission. CCIA was created, as we know, 2 years ahead of the WCC itself, particularly to serve as a voice for the churches internationally in the formation of a new intergovernmental system to prevent war and to protect people and communities against the sort of violence, oppression, and abuse that had been inflicted on them by the powerful in the past. Our forebears were especially invested in promoting the development of international law to provide this protection, including through engagement in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and subsequent normative instruments of international law. But now, and this is the depressing part, both the foundations of international law and the institutions and mechanisms of global governance face a very serious threat. The solemn commitments made to accountability to the rule of law and to international cooperation to address global challenges are now being repudiated at precisely the historical moment when we face an unprecedented convergence of global crises, especially climate change, in the context of which we need more, not less, international cooperation. It is time, in my submission, to return to the first and most central principles and purposes for which this Commission was founded. We are in an historical moment when those principles must either be vigorously defended and advanced, or lost for a generation or more. And for this task, a reflection on the heritage of the life and work movement of ecumenical social thought and action is a salutary exercise. Beyond reflection, it will be necessary in the time ahead for CCIA to scale up its engagement with WCC member churches, ecumenical, interfaith, and civil society partners, governments, and international institutions in our efforts to defend and advance those principles. In my view, the international ecumenical movement is not only a voice for international cooperation, but an embodiment of it. Moreover, the unity and cooperation that we practice in the ecumenical movement is not and cannot be seen as contingent on external funding, but a necessary consequence of our ethics, self-understanding, and faith. That must be our core witness to the world at this time of division. In the meantime, as a matter of accountability to the Commission, it is incumbent upon me to report to this meeting on the work that has been and is being carried out at the level of the Secretariat in CCIA's name. And in choosing from my written text to read certain components, I'm going to focus on those components that are particularly my personal programmatic responsibility, since other colleagues are leading in other areas. But I will highlight some aspects from those other areas as well. Firstly, on peace building. In Colombia, the WCC is continuing its intensive investment in supporting the search for peace in Colombia under the current Colombian government's policy of total peace. In particular, WCC continues to serve as one of the official permanent accompaniers of the dialogue table between the Colombian government and the EMBF of the FARC-EP. This is one of the factions that did not join the 2016 peace agreements between the government and the FARC. In September 2023, Dr. Humberto Chiquilla was appointed as WCC Special Envoy for the peace processes in Colombia. In June 2024, WCC entered into a consortium with DIPAS, the Inter-Ecclesial Dialogue for Peace in Colombia, and the Finnish Evangelical Lutheran Mission, funded by the Finnish government, to strengthen our engagement in peace building in Colombia. And as from January this year, we have reconfigured our representation in the peace processes in Colombia with Ms. Jenny Neme as our resident representative and Deputy Special Envoy, Professor Fernando Enz as our Special Envoy, non-resident, and Dr. Humberto Chiquilla as Senior Advisor. Though relative to most other situations we are currently engaged with, the situation in Colombia is a rare good news story, relatively. The peace process is, at the same time, encountering an increasing number of obstacles, and recently the ceasefire between the Colombian government and the EMBF of the FARC-EP was not renewed. Moreover, there will be elections in Colombia next year, and the window of opportunity for total peace is rapidly closing. To mitigate against the risk of a new government reversing this commitment to a comprehensive peace, the focus must now be on securing the maximum benefit for local communities out of the current processes, and to scale up advocacy for maintaining the international community's strong support for peace in Colombia. And it's in that latter area of advocacy that I think this Commission can and must play a leading role, to maintain the unanimity in the international community in support of peace in Colombia. Israel-Palestine. What can I say about this that hasn't been said, and eloquently and passionately by, in particular, Dr. Ode Kawas? I can't replicate that, but I will at least give you a snapshot. The atrocities being perpetrated in Gaza by the government and armed forces of Israel following the Hamas attacks on 7th of October 2023 have, frankly, exceeded the capacities of the language of outrage to describe. And now, the permanent ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from Gaza is being openly contemplated and planned for. The response of members of the international community ranges from complicity, active complicity, to ineffective expressions of concern. In my view, the only actual or potential constraint on this trajectory are the tribunals of international law, especially the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. Their role in addressing this crisis is testament to the fundamental importance of the instruments and mechanisms of international law in protecting the powerless from the cruelty of the powerful. This is exactly the role that the ecumenical movement, and CCIA in particular, has sought to promote in our historic work for the development of international law. And it is a role for which I believe we must renew and increase our active support. The flagship activity of the WCC in this region is the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program for Palestine and Israel. It is something of a miracle that EAPPI continues to operate, albeit in a constrained environment and in a reduced number of locations, given that essentially every other international monitoring presence in the occupied territories has been expelled or closed. It is a precious and unique contribution by the WCC and the international ecumenical movement to solidarity with and accompaniment of the Palestinian communities of East Jerusalem and the West Bank, who, like the churches in the Holy Land, suffer in an increasingly hostile context of Israeli settler extremism and military occupation. I have sections also on Iraq and Syria. I won't read them. My colleagues who are working on those issues will, if all goes well, join us online at a later time to share their perspectives. Likewise, I will not read the content on Sudan and South Sudan. Our colleague Wushishi, Reverend Wushishi, is with us here in person. He will likewise share more on these and other African country situations, including the content regarding Ethiopia. And I'm grateful that Dr. Negusu Legese is here in person, who can also share very current and on-the-ground perspectives regarding the evolving and, I'm afraid, deteriorating situation in Ethiopia. I will read the section on the Korean Peninsula. WCC has supported inter-Korean encounter and cooperation between the National Council of Churches in South Korea, the NCCK, and the Korean Christian Federation, KCF, of North Korea since the mid-1980s, in a process launched at the 1984 Tosanso consultation. Together with several member churches and ecumenical partners, WCC was also heavily engaged in humanitarian response to the famine in North Korea in the early 1990s. And the CCIA director has moderated the Ecumenical Forum for Peace, Reunification and Cooperation on the Korean Peninsula, the EFK, established in 2008. EFK has served, among other things, as an important coordination point for advocacy on the negative humanitarian and political impacts of the maximum pressure sanctions on the DPRK. However, the future of these important historic processes and ecumenical engagements have been put in doubt since the collapse of the 2019 Hanoi summit between the DPRK and the US, the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic, and especially Kim Jong-un's declaration in December 2023 of his renunciation of his grandfather Kim Il-sung's reunification policy. This represents a seismic shift in the ground on which all of our previous ecumenical efforts have been built. Reunification of the two Koreas is now officially off the table. To the extent that the Tosanso process has been predicated on the pursuit of reunification, we may, as former WCC CCIA staff Eric Weingartner said in a conference marking NCCK's centenary in September last year, we may have to give it a decent burial. After a period of relative silence and non-responsiveness, KCF has, however, recently reopened communication channels with WCC and some other key partners, Dr. Mathews included. However, the communications received give no hope of being able to renew encounter and cooperation between KCF and NCCK. However, they may signal an openness to re-engagement with other international partners outside South Korea and the US. We'll see. I have another section then that I won't read, but it's an important one. It's on West Papua, and I'm sure that most of you will not have heard of West Papua or the conflict in that territory. These are the Papuan provinces of Indonesia in which a long-standing independent struggle has been going on ever since the territory was formally incorporated into Indonesia in 1969. This is an almost entirely Christian population in an increasingly Muslim majority context due to transmigration of Indonesians from elsewhere in the country. And it is very clear that the indigenous Christian community of West Papua is now facing a truly existential threat in their own land. And it's an issue that WCC has been working on for decades, but I really think now that we are coming to a serious crisis point. We do have strong programmatic engagement in addressing the issue. I won't take the time to share the details with you now, but I encourage you to read the relevant section. Likewise, I will not read the section on Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh, which has also been a very long-standing commitment of the ecumenical movement of the WCC, and in which the WCC sought to play a constructive role in the recent, latest, and final confrontation and conflict over the territory. You can read some of the details in the section. I do want to point out to you that, in fact, next week after we conclude our meeting, WCC, in cooperation with the Swiss Protestant Church, will be convening a conference in Bern on Armenian cultural and religious heritage in Nagorno-Karabakh at the specific request of His Holiness the Catholicos Karakin II. I will speak about Ukraine and Russia, and I acknowledge that we have in the room Father Stefan Igumnov from the Russian Orthodox Church, a member of CCIA, who we were not sure would be able to make it, but Father Stefan, I'm very pleased that you managed to find your way, because we have continuing very important and very difficult conversations on the current situation. So I will share my text, which will be challenging, Father Stefan. Since the illegal, full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, and actually much longer, since the crisis began in 2014 actually, WCC has been seeking ways in which the WCC Global Fellowship might assist in reducing the conflict and promoting a just and sustainable peace in the region. The story of those efforts is a long and, sadly, so far, not very positive one. WCC continues to maintain communication with counterparts in the churches of both Ukraine and Russia in the hope that opportunities might emerge for dialogue with and through the churches, and to reflect together on the Christian calling to be peacemakers against the prevailing violence and warfare. It's important to recognize that, in addition to the terrible humanitarian and human rights consequences of this conflict, Russia's invasion of its sovereign neighbor is in flagrant violation of the system of international law and governance designed in the aftermath of the Second World War to prevent war, and which Russia, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, is responsible for maintaining. Russia's illegal aggression has deeply undermined this system that should protect us all from such violence and aggression. In this regard, CCIA should take note of the recent initiative to establish a new international legal tribunal within the framework of the Council of Europe to prosecute the crime of aggression in the context of the invasion of Ukraine. I can share more information about this in discussion later on if needed. I move to the topic of disarmament, especially nuclear disarmament. WCC has called for the elimination of nuclear weapons since its founding assembly in 1948. In recent years, and throughout its previous term, CCIA has been very active with partners in the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, ICAN, in advocacy for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and for its ratification and implementation. CCIA has a long-standing focus on the legacy of nuclear testing in the Pacific and elsewhere, and this has been carried forward through recent visits to the Marshall Islands in November 2023, led by none other than Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson, and subsequent follow-up with the government and of the Marshall Islands and support for relevant initiatives in the UN Human Rights Council. In addition, I also took myself a visit to Kiribati in July last year for the same purposes, to address nuclear testing legacy issues in that context. Now, it's obvious that in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and increasing confrontations and conflicts elsewhere, notably most recently between India and Pakistan, the risks of nuclear war, whether by accident or design, have markedly increased. Moreover, consideration of the possibility of developing independent nuclear capabilities is being undertaken in a number of additional countries. I heard, to my great surprise, that this is even on the table in Sweden. Can you imagine the possibility of Sweden developing a nuclear weapon? Doesn't bear thinking about. CCIA has sought to promote Christian ethical reflection within the churches on the doctrine of nuclear deterrence, particularly in Sweden and Finland as the two newest members of NATO. We hope that this proposal might yet be taken up with support and engagement of members of this Commission. Important to remember that this year is the 80th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, while finances do not currently permit the organization of an ecumenical delegation visit to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as was done for the 70th anniversary, I hope nevertheless that CCIA might be able to lead efforts to promote commemoration of this anniversary within the Ecumenical Fellowship in another way. Let me speak briefly also about autonomous weapons systems. In 2019, the WCC officially joined the campaign to stop killer robots, mandated by a Minute on Lethal Autonomous Weapons Systems, or killer robots, adopted by the WCC Executive Committee in November 2019. In this campaign, WCC joins other civil society partners in advocating for a preemptive international ban on autonomous weapons systems able to operate without meaningful human control. Now, my colleague Jennifer Philpott-Nissen is actually responsible for our work in these fields of disarmament, as well as on the field of human rights advocacy in the UN system. So even though I've trodden upon her territory by reading what I just read, I'm not going to read the section on human rights. Jennifer will be in a position to elaborate further for you and to make proposals to you from a staff perspective of how CCIA might be directly engaged in this work with regard to both disarmament and human rights advocacy in the UN system, and also relevant training and capacity building initiatives on these fields. I move to the next section on the Church's commitments to children and its climate change focus. Now, while we will have our colleague Frederique Seidel joining us online in a later session to elaborate further on this, I am going to read some of these elements. I think that they are very significant for CCIA to be aware of, and also for the Climate Justice and Sustainable Development Commission to take cognizance of. So, CCIA has in recent years had a particularly close working relationship with UNICEF in the framework of the Church's commitments to children, which focus on three main limbs. One is child protection and the elimination of all forms of violence against children. The second one is child participation, promoting the participation of children in church and society. And finally, climate justice initiatives with and for children. So this is where we intersect. Recognizing the existential intergenerational threat posed by the intensifying climate crisis for children and future generations, CCIA has sought to advance additional emergency initiatives beyond and in addition to WCC's historic ongoing advocacy in climate change conferences and other relevant forums. And these new emergency initiatives take two main forms. One is climate responsible finance. In May 2022, CCIA, jointly with the Muslim Council of Elders, the New York Board of Rabbis, and the UNEP, the UN Environment Programme Finance Initiative, launched an appeal for climate responsible finance as a moral imperative towards children. Based on the logic of following the money, this initiative represented a commitment to engaging with our own banks, pension funds, and other financial service providers with regard to their use of the money we have invested with them to ensure that our money is not being used to invest in fossil fuel industries. More importantly, it's an invitation to all members of our constituency, member churches, related organizations, families and individuals, to do likewise. And if done at scale, in a constituency of the global dimensions of the WCC Fellowship, this would certainly have a significant impact on the investment decisions of such financial institutions. But it still needs further amplification and take-up in the wider ecumenical fellowship in order to achieve that impact. Perhaps CCIA members can play a role in this regard. CCIA is also engaging with the World Bank in relation to its role in investing in projects related to fossil fuel infrastructure. The second main limb of these new emergency measures is public interest litigation. Now, litigation is not normally something that the World Council of Churches does, right? So it's quite challenging and new as a form of response for us. But there is a new, more recent initiative called Hope for Children Through Climate Justice, which is a handbook on legal tools to hold financiers accountable. This handbook seeks to equip members of our constituency with information and guidance on the range of legal forums and strategies available for public interest litigation for climate action and climate justice, especially to hold financial institutions accountable for their role in funding fossil fuel exploration and development. CCIA has already held introductory training sessions based on this publication for a number of stakeholders, including the Climate Justice and Sustainable Development Commission. I would like to try and schedule a training session soon for interested members of this commission as well. CCIA has also made submissions to the International Criminal Court encouraging application of its existing mandate to the prosecution of environmental crimes, as well as promoting amendment of the ICC's Rome Statute to recognize ecocide as an international crime. I move to sustainable development. And specifically, I want to tell you about the International Partnership on Religion and Sustainable Development, or PARD. The CCIA Director represents WCC in the governance of the International Partnership on Religion and Sustainable Development, or PARD, created as a partnership of governmental, intergovernmental, academic, and faith-based organizations committed to multi-stakeholder cooperation in advancing progress towards realization of the Sustainable Development Goals. PARD is currently pursuing cooperation in and with the newly established Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, a flagship initiative of Brazil's G20 presidency. Now I speak about relations with the UN system because, as you may be aware, CCIA is the institution within the WCC that is responsible for managing our relationships with the UN system in general. That starts with consultative relations. So we are responsible for managing WCC's consultative relations with the United Nations and for WCC's representation at UN conferences and events. A basic requirement for maintaining consultative status with the UN is the provision of a quadrennial report on WCC's activities related to the UN system. The most recent quadrennial report submitted was for the period 2020 to 2023. And if you're interested, I can make it available for you to read. It's a very brief summary, but it might be of interest to you. Now, partnerships with the UN system entities. WCC CCIA's programmatic partnerships with UNICEF and with UNEP-FI have already been alluded to. WCC CCIA has also had a close working relationship with the UNHCR Statelessness Unit in development of the Global Alliance to End Statelessness, a multi-stakeholder alliance committed to preventing, reducing and eliminating the devastating consequences of statelessness for individuals and communities. WCC also enjoys close working relations with OHCHR, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN Office for Genocide Prevention, the World Health Organization, UNAIDS, and the UN Conference on Climate Change, among other UN system entities. Related to this, I want to tell you about the annual symposium on the role of religion and faith-based organizations in international affairs. This annual symposium is an annual event first launched in 2015 by CCIA and ecumenical partners represented at the UN in New York, but it has quickly become a leading joint initiative of an interfaith network of FBOs and UN system partners. This year's annual symposium, held on the 3rd of April 2025 in New York and online, focused on aspects of the UN Pact for the Future and the emerging crisis for multilateral cooperation. So I think it could also be interesting for CCIA to receive the link to the recording of that event. It's like a half-day event, so it takes some extended listening. But there were many excellent contributions from speakers in that conference. I also want to mention the current situation with regard to our own New York office. You may know that WCC shares an office in New York with ACT Alliance, and we call it the Ecumenical Office to the United Nations in New York. But it's currently vacant. Our position in that office is currently vacant. And we are currently engaged in a process of reconfiguration of WCC's role and representation at the UN in New York, and we are revisiting the whole concept for WCC's relationship with the UN, particularly at New York headquarters. And we're exploring possible synergies with ecumenical partners at the UN in New York, and taking into account, of course, the current crisis for the UN itself and for international cooperation in general. This process is still ongoing. Now, finally, I want to come back to our role in responding to the current crisis for the UN and for international law and cooperation. In this report, I have referred several times to the growing crisis for the United Nations and more broadly for international law and cooperation. The actions of the current US administration are the most recent, most obvious, and perhaps most powerful drivers of this crisis. But the crisis is actually deeper and wider. And though the US may be the largest, it is certainly not the only author of it. Among other things, as I mentioned, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a deeply undermining event that really challenges and moreover the UN Security Council's inability to address that crisis in any meaningful way is, in my view, really a fatal final blow to the credibility of this structure in its current form. Now, this crisis is not of only peripheral relevance to the WCC. It is central, especially to CCIA and to the purposes for which this commission was established. It demands careful consideration of our response to this crisis, whether, for example, to join calls for a second UN Charter, updated and adapted to current realities, or whether to focus instead on promoting and protecting the framework and mechanisms of international law, which, beyond the UN organization per se, may be the best constraint on abuses by the most powerful, or whether to retreat still further and seek to undergird the most fundamental principles that inspired CCIA to engage in promoting the development of international law and international institutions in the first place. In any event, it is a salutary opportunity to reclaim the spirit of the life and work tradition upon which our Commission is founded, to reassert the principles that we draw from that tradition, to express Christian love in the midst of confrontation, conflict and division, and to be the salt and light of a renewed global community, God willing. I'm sorry for the very lengthy text, but thank you very much for your attention, and I hope I managed to address in some manner the two key feedbacks that I received. from my previous report. Thank you very much.